Oops. Hi, Ezra, can you hear me? Hello, testing. I'll get started in a minute. So once again, I don't have a watch because it's on my phone. So when I get to break time, it's up to you because I can just carry on talking. So, and I think after some time, you stop. Can you hear me? Give me a thumbs up if. Okay, so today we're looking at this paper by Van Gelder called what might cognition be if not computation? And this is a very kind of influential paper. And I think it's influential for at least 3 reasons. So first of all, it kind of presents an alternative to computational models or computationalism. And in the 1980s, many people thought that computationalism, the representational theory of mind, was the only game in town. So this is a quote from Fodor. The only game in town. You know that expression? You know, I want to go to a game. Oh, this is the only game in town. Yeah, so computationalism was the only game in town. That you have this with Newell as well. So this is the quote on the second page of the article that Newell put it. Basically, although a small chance exists that we will see a new paradigm emerge for mind, it seems unlikely for me. Basically, there do not seem to be any viable alternatives. So computationism is the only game in town. No viable alternatives. And one thing about this paper and the sort of framework it's coming out of is it saying, well, yeah, here's a viable, here's an alternative. Now, one question we might want to ask ourselves is it a viable alternative? Yeah, and we've got an alternative way of modeling things. But is it the sort of alternative that could constitute a sort of well-functioning research program? And for those of you in Uzi's class, this is really what his PhD was about whether this type of modeling is a viable alternative as a scientific research program. Yeah, so I actually think my take is that the brain is a complex dynamic system. And ideally, the way to model it would be in terms of simultaneous equations, but there are just too many, there are too many neurons. Yeah, the mass is going to get intractable very, very quickly. So it might turn out that in some sense, in terms of what the brain is, thinking of it in terms of a dynamic system, maybe the most plausible, but is it a plausible scientific research program? I think is a different question. Because other sorts of models, is there going to be any sort of guide to discovery? Yeah. So first of all, it offers an alternative to computationalism. And this is a challenge to the claim that computationism is the only game in town, which in the 1980s, this was the sort of idea in cognitive science. This was when cognitive science was just like, whoa, you know, cognitive science is the study of cognition, and we finally know what cognition is and how to study it. Because cognition is information processing, and with modern computers, we have the tools for modeling and understanding any sort of information processing. So first of all, it offers a sort of challenge to the only game in town story. Second, I think that thinking about this alternative helps us understand something about what computational models are. So I think it helps us get a clearer grasp on exactly what a computational model of something is. Yep. And I think it helps us, in particular, understand something about the limits. Something about the limitations. Maybe not just about the limitations, but get a better grip on how computational models work. And I think one thing that I think is very important to bring away from this has particularly got to do with the question of timing. Yeah. So as we're going to see, when it comes to dynamic systems models, time is integral to the model. We have time within the model. With computational models, sets of algorithms, time isn't normally intrinsic to the model. Yeah. So computational models tell you in what order a bunch of tasks need to be done, but how the timing works, we don't get that. In order to get timing, so I think especially the question of time and how computational models are going to have a problem with time. For modern computers, like the computer on our phone, that you have all of this algorithmic stuff, and then you have a clock. So timing issues are solved by sending messages backwards and forward to some sort of clock. Now, with your laptop, the connections are made out of wires, and the signal goes quite quickly along the wires. So you can send a message, and also computer chips are quite compact. So the distance that needs to be traveled isn't that far. So you have fast wires, not very long distance. Sending a message backwards and forwards to a clock sort of is okay. With the human brain, the neurons are very, very slow transmitters of signal. Yeah, so the signal speed is very slow. And the brain is sort of much bigger than a computer chip. So that you've got slow wiring and you've got long distances. So, I mean, timing is really difficult, I think, to model, and then to think about how it's going to be implemented. And it seems to me that the brain has a sort of intrinsic time. So neurons are sort of oscillators. Yeah, and oscillators are things that vibrate. Yeah, and so vibration is something essentially temporal. So one thing I think that computational models are going to miss is the sort of intrinsic temporality of things. And I think dealing with time is going to be difficult. Yeah, that you can have things like accumulators. You can sort of model temporal stuff. But it's difficult to see how it's going to be implemented in a brain. So I think that thinking about the alternatives, even if the alternatives are not viable alternatives, can help us understand something more about what computation is, yeah, and what are the benefits, limits, and how computational explanations work. And thirdly, this is a kind of paradigm. I'm not sure if it started it, but in some sense, it's an important kind of sally or important move in what I think of as the sort of representation wars in cognitive science. Yeah, and I think this has become one of the big questions in cognitive science, is questions about the nature and status of representation. So in computational models, we say that we've got these symbolic states that are representational, and claiming that these states are representational explain how computational systems are able to do stuff in the real world, how their internal processing relates to the world. So without that, you miss sort of why explanation. But it's very difficult to understand what it is for something to be a representation. And that Van Gelder thinks that these dynamic systems are non-representational. Yeah, so the claim is that if what the brain is a dynamic system, then, and if what cognition then cognition is essentially non-representational. And this, I think there's been big debates. I think within cognitive science, you get a sort of division between the kind of computationalist people and then these sort of more embodied cognition people into embodied cognition, extended cognition. Within kind of the embodied cognition side, I think everyone thinks that, yeah, of course, cognition is embodied and this is something computational models sort of step away from. Within the kind of embodied cognition view, you have some people who are into embodied cognition but are happy with computationalism. So, for example, Andy Clark is one very well known as someone who's into embodied and extended cognition. But he ultimately thinks that cognition is computation. Yeah, it just doesn't all go on in the head. Some of the computations involve pen and paper, not just neurons. Yeah, so you get a sort of division between kind of, let's say, classic AI and embodied extended, embedded. Sometimes people call this a 4E cognition, or what's the fourth one? Embed? What? Inactive, yeah. Inactive. Embodied, classic AI doesn't really pay enough attention to the embodiedness of agents, and the embodiedness is going to be something important. That, I think one thing about the embodied sort of approach is you might think one sort of move that happened was a move from computers to robots. If we want to understand cognition, we should be developing robots. We shouldn't be building chess programs. Yeah. So if, the concern with embodiment, you may think, well, if we want to understand human cognition, let's start building robots. So that's quite compatible with computational stuff. The robots can be computation. Extended cognition has got to do with the idea that cognition doesn't just occur inside the head. So the best version of embodied, you might think robotics, move towards robotics. Extended, I think the best philosopher guy here is Andy Clark, where not all computation takes place inside the head. Not all, yeah.
But if the computation is not inside the head, then it loses representation side, right? Because it is outside. It's not the observed.
Yeah. So the sort of idea is that when we're doing an addition, yeah, we write down 2 and carry 1, and remember that you carried 1, and then you add these 2 together, and there's some sort of memory going on. And the sort of idea is that, well, that when we're adults, we remember stuff in our head internally, but we can also do it on paper. So we can use a bit of paper as an external memory. And so we write something down on the paper, look at the paper, and so the writing on the paper plays an essential role in but the symbol on the paper I write down 1 and I've got 2 written down. These are representations. So the idea is that we've got these symbols, we've got some external symbols.
Yeah, but like the command to move your arm is also represented inside, and you cannot put it outside, right? So there's always like I don't see the I don't.
Well, you could have a certain kind of let's suppose you've been to a physiotherapist and your physiotherapist says you've got to do this kind of a series of exercise in order. Now, one way to do this is you just remember the moves internally and then you just go through a sequence. But I'm really bad at that. So I think that, you could be German, you want to dance and it says, for 1, 2, sorry if there's any Germans in here. Are you German? Yeah, okay, I can do that. Not you. No, I once went to Brazil. In southern Brazil, you've got lots. I'm going to dig deeper. And there's lots of Germans. And you go to a salsa club and you've got these Brazilians. And then you've got some Brazilians. And it's like, there's this German can't dance gene, I think. They're kind of doing techno dancing, samba. Yeah, sorry. I used to live in Berlin. So I do like techno. So maybe I've got the German. Yeah, but you might think that you could have a sequence of moves that you want to learn. And when you first learn them, you could write the sequence on paper. So you could have a picture of your arm like this and a picture of your arm like this. And so there, in some sense, you go through this sequence of moves. And you could think of the things on paper as something like motor commands. But instead of internalizing them, you have them on paper.
But if you think that we are by will acting on the movements, then there will still be a decision movement that cannot be represented outside. So you cannot fully be expanded.
Oh yeah, so of course it's not saying that, this extended view is quite compatible with the idea that the brain is essential for cognition. Yeah, because it might be without a brain, you can't do any of this stuff. But the sort of idea is not all of the processing takes place necessarily inside the brain. So that if
Excuse me, sir. You are on mute now.
oh, sorry. Okay, can you hear me again? Was I on mute the whole time? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, I assume you can. Oh, hello? Am I on mute still? Is there anyone there? Hello? Hold on. Self-driving mode. Sorry, how about... Hold on. Your video is... Hold on. Okay, I'm no longer in self-driving mode. Can you hear me now? Yes. Oh, good.
Yes.
Yes. Oh my God, I'm in an infinite loop. I'm never going to be able to get out. Yeah. So, I mean, this is what we're not going to be looking at Andy Clark's extended mind stuff. If you're interested, he's got a book called Supersizing the Mind, which is a fun book. I think it's really it's a sort of book to read on the metro. I don't know if anyone's read it, but it's, you know, it's very readable, it's very stimulating, and I would recommend it. And him and David Chalmers, yeah, wrote sort of 7-page paper that was published in Analysis, a very short paper arguing for this basic extended mind hypothesis. And then this book was written afterwards, and the paper is an appendix to the book. So if you're interested in looking at the argument, but the sort of argument is, Andy is a sort of into computationalism. So a couple of times I sat down there and argued with him about whether or not to be, and he's very much a computationalist and a functionalist. And the argument in the Extended Mind book is basically like, you know, that you've got internal memory, and then you've got memory on a paper. And what it is to remember is to be explained in terms of its functional role. And so if you've got something having the same functional role, then it doesn't really matter whether it's internal or external.
But the point is that it's not doing the same function at all, because you still have the internal, you cannot dispense it, so it's not the same.
Well, he tells the story of someone with Alzheimer's who's lost, or you might have a specific, you might forget. There might be a certain domain where you forget things. Yeah, so that's broken internally, and then you just use a notebook. So you might lose the ability to remember what your plans are for the day, and you just keep a diary. You know, you have your phone beep you when you're supposed to do something. I mean, yeah, the big question is whether internal memory and external memory play the same functional role. And I think actually, if you start looking at how internal memory works, maybe not. So Kirk Michaelian, this is his sort of criticism of Andy Clark, yeah, that he thinks that internal and external, using an external device, are really functionally quite different, so that you haven't got the same functional role. Yeah, so you've got people in embodied, extended, embedded cognition. Has got to do with the idea that that cognizers are embedded in an environment, yeah, and that any sort of explanation. So I think these two views, the embodiedness and extendedness, are quite compatible with computationalism. Yeah, you could think that cognition is embedded and extended, but then, you know, think that you can model it by having robots with in internal stuff. That the embeddedness is the idea that organisms are essentially, the environment is essential to the organism, and you can't remove the organism from the environment. And I take it that I think we're going to look at next this article by Richardson about in the philosophy of biology. We're going to take a step back from cognitive science and think about what biological systems are. And I take it that his sort of thought is that biological systems are essentially embedded. They essentially involve an exchange of energy with their environment. And cognition is essentially embedded. So you can't abstract away from the environment if you want to understand cognition. Yeah, so the computational model tend to abstract away from the environment, because once you've got the input and the output, all you need to think about is what happens in between the input and the output. And the cause of the input you can stop thinking about in terms of your internal model. These sort of embedded approaches sort of stress the importance of the environment. So I think one of the main types of embedded cognition are going to be these Gibsonians. So Gibson, we're going to look at later in the semester, and he's into ecological psychology, where psychological explanation, what's essential to psychological explanation is going to be the environment of the organism. And it turns out that in some sense the processing might be too complicated. It might be that the best you can say about processing is that the organism has evolved in such a way that they have a sensitivity to certain parameters in the environment. And then really what's of most interest is in some sense looking at the environment and understanding what are the things in the environment that the organism is sensitive to. So ecological psychology tends to, to understand cognition, instead of looking in the head, you look at the world. You sort of look at the environment. And it turns out there's a lot to be done by looking at the environment and working, because the environment's very complex, got lots of information in the environment, and then working out how an organism can, which bits of information an organism can use to solve tasks, turns out to be very interesting. These Gibsonians tend to be anti-computational and to quite like the dynamic system stuff. But I don't think you really need that. I think that the Gibson himself, yeah, you can forget about what's going on internally. And then you have these inactive approaches. Have anyone heard of inactivism?
Yes, Yunus was talking about a lot, but I didn't check by now.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, inactivism's weird, because I'm never really exactly sure. So there was a very influential book from the 90s. Was it the 80s or the 90s? By this guy, Varela. It was Varela, Thompson,
Roche.
yeah, and Roche. Varela is a sort of biologist, Brazilian. Is he Brazilian? What's Italian? Brazilian. He's a biologist. Evan Thompson is a philosopher. And Eleanor Roche, you may have, if you're a psychologist, you may have heard of her. She did a lot of work on concepts. So she developed this sort of prototype theory in psychology. So you do that in psychology.
Yeah,
You've come across her?
I don't know.
Yeah. So she's quite well known in psychology. If you're interested in things like concept, I don't think anyone who really does that sort of research for us.
In what sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. What is a concept? So the traditional view is so that you might think, well, the study of concepts in psychology. I've taught a couple of times at graduate seminar on concepts, so yeah, I know about concepts. Yeah, but traditionally we think of concepts in philosophy as having definitions, and then you kind of in philosophy you might think, oh, what you do is conceptual analysis, and you're kind of uncovering the definition of the concept. Now, this sort of view was attacked by Wittgenstein in the 1930s in the philosophical investigation. He said that you don't have any strict definition. Like you've got the word game, try and define what game is. You've got a bunch of practices, and there's a sort of instead of being a strict definition, you've got a sort of family resemblance between games. So this game, you know, there's some card games, and the card games all sort of resemble each other in a certain way, or competitive card games. But then you have patience. That's a game, but there's no competition. So you've got a bunch of overlapping sort of, you've got no strict criteria that give you necessary and sufficient conditions for what a game is. And Roche sort of took this idea and then tried to operationalize it and do experimental research on it. So you might think that and the psychological research on concepts has got to do with how we go about applying concepts. Yeah, what sort of criteria we use. In psychology, you're like Roche, she has prototype theory, where you have a kind of like, I mean, think about a bird. So a penguin's a bird, yeah, but it's not stereotypically a bird. If you think of a bird, you know, yeah? So a kind of, I don't know, a seagull and a pigeon, they're sort of stereotypically birds. Yeah, they're the sort of prototypes of what it is to be a bird. Yeah, so one view is you're some sort of prototype, and then you've got things about how close they are to the prototype. Her sort of view, I think, is you have a bunch of features, So you have a list of features, and then you have a kind of probability distribution. And you might think that this sort of work on concepts is connected to stuff about classification. Yeah, you might think that computational accounts of how we recognize things is coming out of this literature. Yeah, so you have a bunch of features, you give them some sort of weighted thing. So it's sort of theories of classification.
When by things like this neuronal or like cellular organ, like that she does like symbolic neurons.
I mean, so this is before machine learning, right? This is then, I mean, she was doing this in the 70s. Yeah. 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 So this, I mean, all of this machine learning stuff, you might think is coming out of a bunch of this work about concepts in the 70s. Yeah, but Varela and Thompson wrote this book called The Extended Mind. But no, sorry, that's embodied mind. Yeah, embodied mind. Yeah, and they have this idea of what they call autopoiesis, that living systems are somehow self-creating, and they enact themselves. I think inactivism is just weird. Now, what is inactivism and why? And I mean, so their sort of picture. We're going to talk a little bit about autopoiesis next class. So we're going to talk about this article about why animals are not machines, why biological systems are not machines, and if they're not machines, what are they? And the sort of view we're going to be given is the sort of view we find in Varela and Thompson. But these were the sort of in the 80s, we had these sort of kind of embodied radical, these sort of embodied cognition people. And one thing is that people who were into stressing embodiment, some of them were just like, wow, we can keep computational models. Yeah, so you had some who were computationalists. Then you had some of them who were kind of anti-computationalist. Yeah, or non-computationalist. And then some of them were very strongly anti-representational. Yeah, that cognition doesn't involve any sort of internal representation. And I take it that the people into embedded cognition and the people into inactivism tended to be anti-representational. That cognition does not essentially involve representation. Yeah. And I think that Van Gelder, in some sense, is one of the first people in the sort of philosophical literature to strongly kind of suggest an account that is non-representational. Yeah. So his claim is that if cognition is best understood in dynamic terms, then cognition is non-representational. And then the question is, well, what do you mean by that? What is it here, representation? Yeah. And I think one of the slogans is in psychology, you have, correlation is not causation. Yeah. Well, I think one of the things in the philosophy of cognitive science is that correlation is not representation. Yeah. So I think in psychology, quite often that people talk about one thing representing another. Purely if there's just a correlation. So there's some correlation between this thing in the world and something going on in the brain. Therefore, we've got a representation. It seems obvious if you think about it that correlation is not in and of itself sufficient for representation. You've got all sorts of things correlated with one another without one of them representing another. One thing about correlation goes in both directions. If A is correlated with B, then there's going to be some sort of correlation in the other way. Yeah, there will be. Yeah. So correlation is not sufficient for representation. And so one of the things I think is interesting about Van Gelder's article is that he argues that the dynamic systems are non-representational. I think here's an interesting, when you've got two things, you got a whole system and you've got correlations between parts of the system. You may think that, well, there's a correlation between this and this, and we can talk about this representing that. But Van Gelder brings in a kind of what I think could be a very plausible criteria about when we should appeal to representation, which is, does appealing to representation add anything to your explanation? Or is it just like a gloss you're adding on top? If it doesn't play any explanatory role, then you shouldn't be using representation talk. You should only be using representation talk if appeals to representation help explain how the system works. And he kind of formulates this sort of criterion for when we should be using representation language. And I think it's quite a useful way of thinking about it. What time is it now? What? 34. Oh, 34. Okay, so we've got a bit of time. Okay, so I'm going to clean the board. I'm going to jump into the article. So where I'm using the board cleaner as you've already got me a little holder for my, and then I lost it. So don't tell her. I hope she doesn't listen to these recordings. Maybe I'm hoping it's in my other classroom. So, okay, so this paper is called, who read this paper? Okay, how do you find it? You see, it's quite well written. There's a bit of math in the middle, which when you first read it, it's like, oh, but actually, once you understand it, it's really quite simple. The math, even I can understand it. So it has to be fairly simple. So this is, I think this is really an article that's worth reading. So it's called, what might cognition be if not computation? And what's the answer? So I think there's one alternative. So what are the alternatives?
Government.
Yeah. So he says on page. Yep.
Continuous interlinked system.
I think something like that. Yeah. He says it kind of a bit technically on page 346. He says, rather than computation, cognitive systems may be dynamic systems. Yeah, so these systems might be dynamic systems. Rather than computation, cognitive processes may be state, space, evolution within a dynamic system. Yeah, so we have a sort of, rather than we have cognitive processes, and the idea is that we're supposed to think of these processes as state space evolution within a dynamic system. That's what a cognitive process is. A state space evolution within such a system. Now, I mean, the maths here is sort of quite technical, but the basic idea, I think, is understandable. So, and I think he does a nice job of explaining it. So in order to, I mean, his whole paper, if you understand that sentence, you've really understood the main point of the paper. It just turns out to understand that sentence, you've got to understand a bit about what dynamic systems are and how they work, how they differ from a computational system. So in order to explain that one sentence, he then tells us about a bit of history. So in the 18th century, I think it's the 18th century, yeah, 1788-ish. England wants to rule the world. To do that, it's got to take all the cotton and spin it. Yeah? So for world domination, yeah, Britain gets world domination by becoming the center of the cotton trade. Cotton's really interesting. I read a book recently about cotton. It's just called Cotton. It's sort of about global capitalism and how the global capitalist system sort of radically changed how Britain basically became the centre of the economic world by becoming the centre of the cotton trade. And it did this, I mean, partially through this guy Watt. So when you've got cotton mills, you need some source of energy. Yeah, and what you want is a rotating energy. So you want something rotating, yeah, to drive the mills. And what Watt did is Watt invented a steam engine. So Watt is one of the great engineers, and Watt invented a steam engine. And the steam engine, the sort of Watt steam engine converts kind of this sort of pumping motion. You've got this piston pumping out into circular motion. Yeah. So once you've got this kind of pumping action that is then driving a spindle and creating rotation. Yeah. And this then is being plugged into the spinning wheels, and it's spinning cotton. Yeah. And wow. Yeah. Well, if you can do this, you can dominate the world. And Britannia rules the waves and everything. Yeah. So it's really kind of a big deal. Unfortunately, what's the problem? So if you've read the paper, he invented this, but there was a problem. He invented the steam engine, he kind of got the rotation, powering the cotton mills, yeah?
There is a equation for art, and it's must be so that right amount of power must be given in the right time.
Okay, that's the solution. But what's the problem? Because the problem's really simple, and you just explained the solution to the problem.
For sewing, you need continuous speed, but the steam isn't like it differs, and also the sewing then like influences back the speed of the.
Yeah, so the problem, you've got this rotation, and the problem is that the speed, because you know, you've got a coal engine, you've got bits of coal, and then one bit of coal flares up. Yeah, so the way coal burns is not uniform, and so the engine speed isn't uniform. Yeah, so there's one bit of coal that kind of flares up, and it suddenly gets very hot, and that creates a big burst of energy that causes the kind of speed to kind of change. Yeah, it's speeding up, slowing down, and if it's driving the cotton mills, the cotton, if the speed keeps changing, it all gets tangled up. It's all a mess. Who wants tangled? You know, you've had wool and it all gets tangled up into a mess, and it's just like you might as well give up. Yep. So the problem is that the speed of rotation is not uniform. Yeah? So you've got to have a way of keeping the speed uniform. Yeah, that's the problem. And then, how do you do this? How do you what? Yeah.
By managing the we call it arms, the arms to stay still in a.
Yeah. So I'm a really bad drawer. So you've got this engine with two arms. Oops. Here is the engine. Oops. Let's see here. Here, you've got a valve. Yeah, so you're talking about the arms here. This is how his solution worked. And how his solution worked is that, well, you've got this valve that can let steam into the pistons. Yeah, so you've got the steam heating up. Now, if the speed gets too quick, what do you do? Yeah, you slow it down. So if I understand it, the valve is letting more or less steam in. But there's one way of doing it where you can let off steam. Yeah, where if the steam grows too much, you open it and it flies out into the thing. I think this is a valve though that is letting steam into the piston. So if the steam is getting too much, you close the valve, so you limit the amount of speed going in. And if things are going too slow, you let in more speed. And so you've got this valve, and you open it, and it speeds up. You close it, and it slows down. So you basically got a controller here that allows you to increase the speed or decrease the speed. Yeah, and now so you've got this valve. Now one way of solving this would be just to have a little man or a little woman who stands there and looks at the speed, and if the speed increases too much, they open the valve. If it slows down, they close it. So one way of solving this problem, I think initially they tried to do something like this, is you just have a person there who basically intervenes. If things are going too quickly, close the valve. If things are going... Now, this of course isn't very practical. Human beings are expensive. You've built these steam engines to save on labor with a kind of Elon Musk of the 18th century. Yeah, you want everyone to be unemployed and make lots of money. Yeah, so you don't want to keep paying someone to sit there. Also, kind of, people are very slow. Yeah, so having a human being doing this, they're not going to be. You want to keep it really constant, and the speed at which human beings can do this are going to be very. It's going to be too slow, really. Is it? I mean, they could do it, but it's not great. Now, today, if you gave an engineer this problem today and it hadn't been solved with cheap microchips, yeah, you could. One way of solving this problem is by having a sort of computational system. Yeah, so he starts the paper rather than by looking at how people actually solve it. So you're going to tell us how he actually solved the problem. it's the angle, yeah. But there's a sort of one way you could solve this problem is by kind of having a sort of program, and this is the first thing he looks at, and the computational way of solving this can be thought of as a set of algorithms, a set of rules, a set of instructions. Now, these instructions could be followed by a person. Yeah, so this set of algorithms could be followed by the sort of guy who's been employed to do it, or it could be followed. You could get a little microchip to do it. Yeah, so the sort of the algorithmic way would be something like this. You measure the flywheel speed. So you measure the speed of rotation. You compare actual speed with desired speed. Then you compare the results. Yep. If there's no discrepancy, return to step one. If A equals D, goes to 1. So if the actual speed and the desired speed are the same, don't do anything, but wait for a second and measure again. Yeah. Otherwise, measure current steam pressure, calculate desired alteration, and calculate valve. Yeah, so on here, you might think if we're going to have a person doing this, you've got a kind of something here that is tells you what the speed of rotation is. Yeah, you could have a sort of something like one of those things on an aeroplane, a sort of speedometer, and on here you have something that shows you This tells you speed of rotation. Yeah. Then if the speed of rotation is too high, then you have to sort of basically, you're going to have to reduce the steam pressure. If the speed of rotation is too slow, you want to increase the speed pressure. And depending on how high or how low it is, that's going to tell you how much to put in. If the speed is really low, you've really got to open the valve a lot. But if the speed is just slightly off, you might just want to kind of tinker with it. You just give it a little kind of, you might even want just to nudge it, you know. But that's basically the algorithm, yeah. And then once you've done this calculation, you make adjustment. Yeah, and then you return to step one. That's a way of solving the problem computationally. And in some sense, you've got a kind of modular system. You've got the different things that sort of encapsulated. The measuring the flywheel speed. This is a bit like the input. This is going to be the perception. Yeah, so the perceptual system, that kind of that gives a measurement. Then you've got the sort of the internal executive control, central processing, that kind of takes the input and calculates what needs to be done. And then you get this calculated valve adjustment, and this is like the output. And this is going to be something like motor command. Yeah, so this way of thinking of this sort of system is analogous to how Fodor is thinking of the cognition. Yeah.
Every step, the information can be extracted, right? But it is explicit. But in every step, if you were to pause it, we could like see where it is at that moment about on its computation.
I mean, yeah. I mean,
it must be registered.
Yeah. I mean, the way it's done is even the internal stuff is done algorithmically. You could have this and this being measurement output, and then this you could have some sort of neural net doing this, I guess. So I mean,
but if it's not like if you're not able to extract it at any point, then it's not algorithmical.
Yeah. So I think the system, you know, it's done the measurement. And so the system first of all has to do the measurement, and then you know that. I mean, so one thing is that yeah, so it's not clear to me that you first have to do this and then do this, because it might be that you just always do the calculation and the result of the calculation is 0. Yeah, so it seems to me that in some sense you might think you can get rid of this, measure current steam pressure, calculate desired alteration, and it might be that the desired, in the case when actual speed pressure, actual speed and perceived speed are the same, you might go through all of this and then you calculate the valve adjustment and it's 0. Yeah, the way he's got it. So I'm just not exactly sure what you mean, but I take it that you have a series of steps and these steps need to be done in order. Yeah, but I take it that the steps are 1, 2, 3, and 4. I think within 3, and you might think that in terms of the steps, you might think that kind of you've got 2 perceptual systems, and is this measuring current steam pressure part of step 3? So it seems when you start saying, when you look inside, how are the steps going to be done? It's not obvious that, because you might think that you can measure the speed and the steam pressure simultaneously, and then you get these two inputs into the system. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, so this is how you would sort of solve it using a sort of computational set of algorithms. Now we might fiddle around a bit with you might think that you're always measuring the flywheel and measuring the steam pressure. I guess if you're thinking of this as if you're training someone to do the job, yeah, I guess you might think that you only need to bother to look at the steam pressure if the flywheel if something's going wrong. Yeah, so you might be sitting there having your cigarette, reading a paper, keeping your eye on the speed, and if the speed is within limits, you just do nothing. Yeah, and you don't, and then suddenly the speed goes off, and then suddenly you have to go and have a look at the current steam pressure. Yeah, it's like, oh, something's gone wrong. Now I need to kind of make an adjustment. Boom. Yeah, so I think if you're thinking of an algorithm that's going to be used by a human being doing this, yeah, you can think of the steps that you would use to train someone. Yeah, so I think when he's talking about the first way of solving this is by just getting a person to do it. The person can kind of sort of implement this program. And you asked me the question, like, looking at what the person's doing, you can see what are the things he's doing or she's doing. Yeah. If you're getting a chip to do it, I think maybe you're going to do it slightly differently. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, this is how we'd solve it computationally. We'd have a series of steps we have to follow. You could train someone to do this, and imagine they're just really quick and they're following this. If they do it properly, they're going to be able to probably keep the speed fairly constant. Now, this is not how Watt solved the problem. So do I have time? Oh, okay. Oh, it was just 35 a minute ago, and I was like, okay. So let's have a break, 10 minutes, and then we'll talk about how Watt solves it. And
Bingöl'ün orada sanırım iş biraz da bir sahiplik vesaire.
Şey diyebilirim, dersler daha böyle hani keyifli okumak
Evet, yani işte ona da Celal'e bir bir şey yapıyorsan, o falan varsa ona da geldi oluyor yani işte.
Yes.
Okay. Did everyone leave? They saw the maths on the board and were like, hell no. I'll go for a few minutes. Oh, I need to put the. Okay, guys, I'm back. Wow. There's maths. I'm back with maths. Exciting. That's it.
I was gonna ask, in linguistics, we have a word embedding function.
Yeah.
And is it called embedding because of the embedded cognition school of thought? Because I think they basically do the same thing.
Yeah, but I'm not sure. Yes, I've heard of that in linguistics, but I'm not. I don't exactly know the context and when it was.
I think
Yeah. Yeah. What is it?
so. It is like in order to teach computers or machines what the semantic content of words, we take a corpus large body of text and we check common concurrences and in the absence of a certain word, what other words could be there? And according to that statistical distribution, we get like at another step, there's a vector space with take these words and we classify them according to their features, like is it an alive being or is it male or female,
Yeah.
properties and stuff like that. And we develop a few hundred dimensional vector space, and the words that are closed in that vector space are closed semantically.
Yeah. So I mean, so you're saying that the kind of meaning of a word is to be explained in terms of its relations to other words, its structural context. I mean, yeah, so I take it that embodied cognition, though, has got to do with, it's essentially, I think, the idea that the environment is, and whereas in some sense you could do, I mean, in some sense you could drop, you're doing semantics here just by looking at relations of things interlinguistically. Whereas I think that the people into embedded cognition are going to say, no, you can't really do that because, no, in order to do semantics, you've got to understand the way in which the organism is embedded in the environment. And so I think that embeddedness is a sort of property that is similar across the two uses of the word embedded. But I think the thing about the people into embodied, embedded, it sounds a bit sexy, doesn't it? It's like embodied, embedded in yeah. But the thing about the embodied, embedded, inactive, extended cognition has got the embeddedness side has got to do with the fact that, for example, you're not going to be able to understand semantics without understanding the fact that the organism is something that has an environment. Whereas I think this use of kind of extracting that you just have a corpus and you can forget about the world. This is all stuff interlinguistic. It's interlinguistic embeddedness. It's not about the embeddedness of the language understander within a real environment.
As far as linguistics is concerned, we can say that there is a word, it is the organism, and the word for the word is the words surrounding it. The words around it is the word for that organism.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a nice analogy.
But the main critique in word embeddings is that it's not linked to the environment.
Yeah.
You can make sentences that make sense and they're correct, but they don't provide proper solutions because they just don't have no clue about the actual world and the environment. So it's embedded just in the sense of context and corpora and mathematics, but not in the sense of the actual
Yeah,
environment.
it's not embedded. I mean, I think the word embedded is being used in a similar way across, but the people into embedded cognition are making exactly this sort of criticism of purely interlinguistic accounts of meaning. I think one thing, when we look at Tomasello, I think one thing is that for meaning, I take it if you want an embedded account of meaning, you might think things like demonstratives are going to be really important. Yeah, how we're able to point to things. And then you might think that meaning involves some sort of capacity for joint attention, that we can refer to the same thing. Yeah, and that's something that you're, so I mean, so one thing is that you're not going to be able to cash out demonstratives in those terms. And anything that the meaning of which depends on demonstrative stuff. And then you might think demonstratives are everywhere in human thought and understanding. Yeah, but I think the notion of being embedded, there's a common notion, but the criticism is really, there's a criticism, exactly the point you're making. It's the people talking about embeddedness are will be criticizing certain ways of doing, say, linguistics, that is just looking at relations between the corpus, is because they don't pay attention to the embeddedness of the organism in the system, in the environment. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but maybe the language. So I think this talk about embeddedness, I think it's kind of coming from about the 80s. When was that literature coming? Yeah.
Like 10 years ago.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that sort of rose with sort of machine learning. Yeah, it's a sort of technique in machine learning. Yeah, if people are interested, you know, there's Wordle, but there's another. Have you tried Semantle? I do Semantle every day, and it's sort of fun, yeah. What? Yeah, so Semantle. It's a bit like Wordle, except they choose a word. It could be any word in English, and then you have to guess it. And it tells you sort of how close the word is, but based upon, I think, yeah, some sort of notion of semantic similarity that's based upon kind of some sort of machine learning sort of thing like this. You've got a corpus, and then they've got some sort of definition of, they've got some way of calculating semantic closeness.
So if words occur in the same context, then they're semantic.
Yeah. And so, yeah. And it's sort of fun. Have you played this game? It's sort of fun because at first it's quite difficult, and then after some time you get a better idea of what it is. So yesterday I did, and it tells you when you get into the first thousands and it goes green, you get a word that's green, and so yesterday, what was it I did? The day before yesterday was, I got woman, and it was about 600. And it turned out that then I could think about stereotypes about women. It is all about stereotypes. And then suddenly I got gossip. And it was like, boom. And it was newspaper. And I think kind of somehow woman, gossip, newspaper was sort of, yeah, but it's sort of an interesting game. If you like, and Zubaidi does it, she does it with the thesaurus, and I try and do it without the thesaurus. She's not a native English speaker, but sometimes I just give up. Yeah, and it's sort of quite interesting to see what sort of words get put it kind of in some sense have this sort of semantic closeness. But there's actually an explanation of the exact. Yeah, it is some sort of, I think it's some sort of co-occurrence sort of metric. I'm not exactly sure the. Okay, so this is how we solve the problem with a computer. This is not how Watt did it. So we've got this thing rotating, and so how does the what governor work? How so this is you've been waiting to tell us this all this time. You've done your bit. You've already done it. How does his solution to the problem work? What happens as this rotates more quickly? Yeah, so you've got this spindle attached to the rotating wheel. I guess the rotating thing is going like this, and then you've got some spindle geared to it. Yeah, so it's the speed of rotation of this is tied to the speed of rotation of the main shaft. And this is basically the speed of rotation. Yeah. As the speed of rotation increases, you've got these balls here. As the speed of rotation increases, what happens? Well, you have centrifugal force. And by centrifugal force, the balls come outwards. Yeah, so as the speed of rotation increases, this angle, let's call this angle theta. Hey, theta, yeah? Yeah. I'm very rusty. So we've got this angle theta, and as the speed increases, these balls are pushed out by centrifugal force. Now, this system is attached to the throttle. So basically, as the angle increases, as the angle increases, so as the speed of rotation increases, yeah, the angle increases, and that as the angle increases, and as it flows speed increases, the centrifugal force pushes out the balls, the angle increases. There's a kind of mechanical system that then, as it increases, it closes the valve, which slows down the engine speed. Yeah. And if the engine speed gets slower, what happens as the engine speed gets slower? The speed of rotation goes down, the angle decreases. As the angle decreases, the throttle valve opens, and this kind of increases the engine speed. Yeah, so there's a sort of, you can see how this system works is it very quickly hits a stable angle, a stable rotation speed, and sort of sticks there. So this system, very quickly, you can start the throttle valve not anywhere, but in a large range of places. And very quickly, the system will find sort of the valve is at a certain level, the angle is at a certain level. Now, when Watt invented this regulator, just there's a pressure to decrease it, there's a tendency, and as it decreases, there's a pressure in the other direction. Yeah, so once you reach a stable state, Yeah, and if there's a little perturbation away from that state, there are going to be forces that are going to push it back. So if you have got it running stably, and then you just open the valve randomly, what will happen is that the system will go a bit messy for a bit, but then it will bounce around and finally get back to where it was to begin with. Yeah, this is basically the idea. Now, when Watt invented this, you could see why he did this and how you could fiddle around with it. I think this would solve the problem. But he didn't understand why it worked. And we've looked at this kind of how a computational system would do things. What Van Gelder does is then spend a bit of time talking about how the computational system works before explaining to us the this system. I'm going to go the other way around. So I'm going to first of all just say a little bit about how the actual Watt regulator works. So in the about 100 years afterwards, in the 19th century, Maxwell. How do you spell Maxwell? Is it an L? Is it an E? Yeah, it's with an E, isn't it? Maxwell. Why don't I say Maxwell? Maxwell. Yeah. He was very great. He's the greatest physicist. Anyone here do physics? Was he the greatest sort of physicist of the 19th century? What? I don't know, but he was definitely up there. Yeah, he great mathematician, great kind of physicist. And he basically came up with the equations such that we understand how the system works and what's going on. And basically, to understand how the system works, we've got two equations. This is the first equation. So this equation tells us about the relationship between the engine speed and the angle. Yeah. So let's assume that the engine speed is fixed. Yep. If the engine speed is fixed, this is what this thing tells us. That this, anyone know what this is? What does this mean? Can anyone remember high school maths? Did you do what? This is the second derivative. So this is the rate of acceleration of the angle. Yeah, so this is about whether it's staying at a constant speed, that would be 0, or whether it's kind of so it's basically this is the acceleration of this angle, the change. So it's the change of the angle. Yeah. This is basically a function of the engine speed. So the acceleration is going to be a function of the engine speed and the current angle. Yeah. Plus it's going to be a function of the current angle. Yeah, because the angle basically is a proxy for the how wide the valve is open. Yeah. So the reason everything's going to be a function of the angle is because the angle is correlated with how much the valve is open, how much steam there is going into the engine. And the speed of the change of the angle. So once it's reached a steady state, there's no acceleration, there's no change in the angle. Basically, what you're going to have is this is going to be 0, this is going to be 0, and you're going to have this is going to be equal to this. Yeah, and given a fixed engine speed, this is going to be anyway. How a system like this works is that you basically have, for this equation, given a particular engine speed, so everything else here, these are all sort of constants. These are sort of things that are given, how big and how sorry, so let me. Yeah, so you've got the length of the arms, you've got something measuring the friction. So all of these letters are basically constant that you don't need to worry about. Yeah. What's important here is that the current acceleration of the engine speed is going to be a function. Sorry, the current acceleration of the angle is going to be a function of the engine speed and the angle. It's plus it's going to be a function of the position of the angle at the moment and its sort of instantaneous velocity. So you've got instantaneous acceleration of the angle is a function of the engine speed and the actual angle at the moment, the angle and the velocity, the rate of change, the angle. Once you've reached a steady state, this and this are going to be 0, yeah, because once you've got an equal, if you get to an equilibrium, then there's not going to be any change in the angle. There's not going to be any change in the acceleration of the angle or of the speed of the angle. Yeah. So this is basically the equation that governs this system, given that the engine speed is fixed. Yeah. If the engine speed is fixed, this equation governs the way the arms change. And mathematically, how this works is for a large number of omega and these constants, this system is going to reach quite quickly a stable equilibrium. Yeah. So regardless of where you start with the angle, yeah, for a wide ranges of places you could start, it will bounce around and find a particular equilibrium point. Yeah, a point of maybe here, and then it will be stable there. And if there's only one such a point, you have what's known as a point attractor. Yeah, that the system is attracted to this particular angle, and we'll get to this angle from many different starting points. Sometimes a system like this have multiple attractors. So it might be that if you start from here, yeah, if you start from anywhere between here and here, you'll end up here. But it might be that if you start from here, you'll get a steady state here. So sometimes with these systems, you'll have multiple attractors. You'll have an attractor landscape such that if you think about an abstract space, you can think of something like this. This would be 2 attractors. You might think that anywhere from here to here, the system is going to find an equilibrium here. But if you have a point here, you're going to end up here. If you have a point here, boom, you end up with another stability. So starting points anywhere from here to here, the system ends up finding a steady state over here. Starting any point from here to here, and these points represent arm angles. Yeah, so starting at any of these points, you end up here. Starting over here, you can end up with another point attractor. And these sort of systems, sometimes you have point attractors, sometimes the system, the equilibrium, not for a simple system like this, but for these dynamic systems, sometimes the equilibrium is going to be something like the system will bounce backwards and forwards between 2 things. Yeah, you can have a sort of bistable sort of system where it will kind of hop around at one speed and then bounce to another speed. Now this sort of system isn't like that, but you can have systems that are like that. You're going to have equations that govern things like that. It can be that the attractor can be a kind of path rather than a point. But how these sort of systems work is you have a sort of state space, you have a sort of attractor space, and you can understand for these things that are not changing. So looking at this equation, the only thing that's changing is this. These things that don't change are called parameters. Yeah. And with these sort of dynamic systems, you change the parameters. And sometimes the change of parameters will just shift the attractor point slightly. So if you, for example, one of the parameters is the length of this arm, as you change the length of this arm, the angle you end up at is going to change. Yeah, the kind of the equilibrium state is going to change. Sometimes you change one of the parameters, and the system suddenly kind of radically changes. So you can have a system that has one attractor, and you change one parameter, and you get to a sort of inflection point, and the system suddenly has two parameters. It has two attractors. Yeah, that you can change the parameters, and you can have a sort of stable system that has an attractor. You can change the parameters, change, and then suddenly the system becomes chaotic. Yeah, it goes all over the place. And so people, you know, if you read about chaos theory, this is kind of chaos theory works with this, where you have some parameter, and for a long time you change the parameter, things are quite stable. You change the parameter, you change a particular parameter, the whole system changes its structure. So this is the equation that governs what's going on with the angle as a function of where the angle is at the moment, the speed of the angle, and the engine speed, and it's measuring the acceleration. This equation tells us about the rate of acceleration of the angle given the engine speed and the current state of the angle, plus the current speed, the current instantaneous velocity. Yeah. So this is kind of a fairly well understood equation. Yeah. There's going to be another equation that tells us about, and this is something he looks at on page 537, that tells us somehow about how some sort of derivative of the engine speed could be first derivative, could be second, could be third, but there's going to be some equation that's going to tell us how the rate of change of the engine speed is dependent on a whole bunch of stuff, including the angle. Yeah, so I think this equation gets a bit complicated. I don't know what it is. Yeah, but the basic idea of the equation is you've got an equation that tells you about some derivative of the engine speed and how that is dependent upon the angle. And then to understand how this system works as a whole, you have to kind of combine these two equations. So you take one equation that tells you how this is dependent on itself and the valve. You take another equation that tells you how the current engine speed is dependent on a whole bunch of stuff. I guess one thing about the engine speed is you're going to have the kind of what's going on in terms of the coal. So there's going to be some sort of random fluctuations there. But the engine speed is also going to be dependent on the angle. And then you understand the state of the system as a whole by combining these two equations. Yeah, and this will tell you, when you combine these two equations, this will tell you that how the system itself changes over time. And one of the features of these sort of equations is that given the parameters are within certain bounds, systems like this normally find a sort of steady equilibrium rate. And that's just a feature of these systems. You have a state space attractor landscape such that from a wide range of starting points, you're going to reach the same sort of equilibrium. Yeah. And so systems like this, if there's some sort of fluctuation in some of the parameters, that doesn't matter because the system, given these fluctuations, Did I just mute myself? Is there anyone else there? Okay, so I'm not muted anymore. I don't think I'm muted anymore. Okay, so we've got these two different ways of solving the problem. And then the sort of thought is, when it comes to human problem solving, you know, if we're information processing devices, then this is going to, you're going to think, well, this sort of model of how we achieve things is going to be the most realistic. If we're something more like dynamic systems, then maybe the best way of modeling what's going on is going to be in terms of sets of simultaneous equations. Now, one thing I forgot to tell you about when I talk about these equations is when we combine these equations, when we've got a system where we've got these two different equations where the sort of output of one equation is a parameter in another equation. So we've got this equation where the only variable, the only thing that can change is this, and this is a parameter. But here we've got sort of this is going to be the sort of output of this equation. So when you've got a system that can only be understood by combining a pair of equations like this, where you have something like a sort of mutual dependency relation in terms of the equation, what you have is you have what you say is that these two parameters are coupled. Yeah, you've got a coupling relation between them. That a change in this determines a change in this, but a change in this then causes a change in this. So these two values are coupled. Yeah, the angle here and the engine speed, these are kind of coupled. Yeah, this is quite a technical notion. And I think this notion of coupling is going to be quite important, because if it turns out that the best way of modeling human behavior is in terms of dynamic systems, and that there are sort of parameters in the environment that are coupled with parameters in the head, then you're not going to be able to understand how the system unfolds over time just by looking inside the head. So if there are things inside my head that are coupled to things in the environment, in this technical sense of coupled, then you're not going to be able to understand how things change in the head just by looking inside the head. You're not going to be able to understand and this is then saying, well, the computational accounts are going to be inadequate, because computational accounts think you can understand the way in which things change inside the head just by looking inside the head. Yeah.
Even if the computation because you are computing something that is out there, but it's just that there is not a coupling where they are equal, but one is like the ghost of the other, the representation. So it's once pole existence is dependent on each other, while they can be separated if the system is destructive. I say that computation isn't because there is still perception, it's explaining perception.
Yeah, so I mean, you might think that if something coupled, that suppose instead of having this angle, you've got a neuron firing. Yeah. Now you've got this neuron firing, and you've got the stuff inside the head. Now, if the way in which this neuron firing changes is coupled with something in the environment, then you're not going to be able to model how the rate of firing of the neuron changes just by looking at the internal environment, if you really have a real coupling. Because the dynamics of what's going on inside the head is going to be coupled to stuff outside the head. Yeah.
Explaining perception, visual perception now is not a computational theory. Where you are looking at this, you see this feature, the neuron starts firing, so this is not a computational theory.
What is not?
This, like when I look at it, and like in vision, there's like this, okay, this line is encoded by some neurons, and then they start firing, and this is built up on like this. So
yeah, so I think that, so So in terms of perception, I'm not sure about whether I think if there's some sort of coupling. But for example, I think that we might think that in joint attention, yeah, that if we're jointly attending to something, so me and Eunice are looking at something together and we're kind of tracking each other's gaze and we're really jointly attending, yeah. One plausible account of this is that in order to understand the joint attention, we have to understand the system as a whole, me, Eunice, and the external object. And then it turns out that you might think, well, there are going to be things going on in Eunice's head. So rates of firing of certain neurons are going to be coupled to certain things in my head. Yeah. So suppose in attention, we've got some way of looking at how attention works. And we find out that attention involves a certain spiking in some sort of neuronal activity. And you might be able to understand individual attention just by looking at in a particular person's head. The sort of thought, though, is that with something like joint attention, yeah, that one plausible hypothesis, which I think there is some evidence for, is that in joint attention, there's a sort of coupling relation that you have to look at me, Eunice, and the world as a single system, and that there are certain changes inside Eunice's head that are dependent upon changes in my neuronal firing, but this is a kind of circular relationship, yeah. And so to understand what's going on in my head over time, you can't just look at what's going on in my head if you've got this coupling relationship between me and Eunice. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
No, it didn't, did it?
I see this. I have this representation of this in my head. But
Yeah.
it's still a interaction that is me with the environment. So even if we believe a computation doesn't, we still take into account environment is what I was trying to say. Like coupling is different because of some other thing I think.
I take with kind of, so I mean, for this algorithmic sort of explanation, that all you really need to look at are the input and the output. So you can explain how. So in terms of the algorithmic thing, you've got a sort of let's suppose this is done by an actual person. You've got a dial on the flywheel. So you've got a dial that tells you the engine speed. And then you've got another dial. So you've got a dial that tells you the speed of rotation. And then you've got a dial that tells you the steam pressure. Yeah, so you have these two kind of inputs. Yeah, and then you have one sort of output. And in terms of what's going on inside the system, and how this unfolds over time, all you have to do is look inside the system. Yeah, because of course the output comes from the environment. So the input comes from the environment. So there is some impact of the environment on the system. But once you've got the input is a sort of given. And then to understand what's happening inside the system, yeah, how the system goes through these various states in order, like once you've got the input, that's all you need to know about the environment. The internal processing doesn't depend upon what's going on in the environment. If you think, though, that there's some sort of dynamic system, and you think that somehow maybe the brain is coupled, there are certain parameters in the brain that are coupled with parameters outside in the world, then you might think there's some sort of input, in some sense of input, but how this cascade of neuronal firing unfolds over time, understanding that internal set of states is something that you're only going to be able to understand by including these external parameters. Yeah, so if you think that you've got some sort of complex dynamic system, and you think that internal states are coupled with external states, then you're not going to be able to understand the internal, the way the internal processing unfolds over time just by looking at what's going on inside the head, because the internal processing over time is going to be always dependent on the environment. And I think that's true because, you know, it's not like you get an input, go through all this stuff and then act, but we're constantly getting sort of energy from the environment and constantly engaging in activity. So the input is continuous and the output is continuous. And as we're sending motor commands, that we're moving and we're changing the input. Yeah, so the input we're getting is always dependent upon our motor activity. Yeah, and so this sort of computational account treats the input and the output as sort of independent of each other. But in some sense, the input is going to be a function of the output, and the output is going to be a function of the input. And the input is going to be a function of the output and factors in the environment. And I think that, yeah, if you think about how the dynamics thing works, that this notion of input and output sort of breaks down. Yeah, and it turns out you're going to have internal states that are just systematically dependent on external states in various ways. Yeah, I think we've done enough today because this is a bit complicated. Next class, I think I'm going to spend one more class talking about the differences between these two types of systems. So we've got the systems, we've got these two different systems, and then we've got these two different forms of explanation. So we've got the systems, we've got two different ways, and then we've got two different models. We've got these different models. What I want to talk about is how these different models work. Now, this is a bit difficult. There's a bit of math. If you don't understand it, not a big deal. I'll talk a little bit about how computational explanations work and how they're sort of homuncular. They don't take into account time in an essential way. The one thing about these is these equations, you know, time is central, because what these equations are about how things change over time. Yeah, so these sort of models are models that are intrinsically temporal. And computational stuff, you kind of getting timing into computational explanations is sort of hard. And doing it in a way that is implementable is hard. Yeah, so